Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Tuesday, August 5th, day 669 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our editor, David Horovitz. Hi, David. Thanks for joining me from our Jerusalem office.
Hey, Amanda.
The Knesset is officially on recess, but you wouldn't know it from the flurry of landmark events that took place yesterday. We will discuss the ministerial vote to fire the Attorney General and the ousting of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee chair over his stance on the Universal Draft Bill. But first, we will learn about reports claiming that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to order the occupation of the entire Gaza Strip, as well as assessments of the health of the 20 living Israeli hostages still held in Gaza. All this and more when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our editor, David Horovitz. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to convene a limited security meeting today to discuss military plans for Gaza, according to a Channel 12 report. Attending the meeting should be Defense Minister Yisrael Katz, IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, and others. During the session, Zamir is expected to present Netanyahu with several operational options for continuing the war in Gaza. Now, according to reports, following yesterday's cabinet meeting, Netanyahu told ministers he intends to seek cabinet approval for a full reoccupation of the Gaza Strip. So, David, we're hearing reports of pushback from some in the military, and obviously the citizens of Israel have what to say as well. How do you think that such a plan would be accepted by Israel?
Well, let's stress that as of this moment, as we're speaking, it is reported that the decision has been taken. I think many unnamed sources were quoted saying last night, and the decision being rather than to give some more time for a possible deal or other options, Netanyahu wants to expand the military operation, including, we should stress, the army claims to control about 75% of Gaza at the moment. There are parts of Gaza where it has not entered. There are parts of Gaza where it has not entered with any significant weight because it is concerned that the hostages are being held there, including parts of central Gaza. And Netanyahu, we are told, is intent on having the army go everywhere in Gaza, including areas where hostages are held, while taking every possible step to ensure no harm comes to the hostages. It is possible that this is some kind of ostensible scare tactic to tell Hamas, we're coming for you, but you've got just not very much time if you want to make a deal, which we would like to make. Hamas is not indicating a readiness to do a deal. We may have been close to a deal, or we certainly were closer to a deal, I think, before the wave of diplomatic moves towards recognizing a Palestinian state, and especially the success of Hamas in highlighting malnutrition in Gaza. A consequence, Israel opened itself to that by stopping aid for 11 weeks between March and May, and then the complications, deadly complications, we should say, with some of the subsequent aid distribution efforts. So Hamas is feeling the world is against Israel. Hamas is feeling relatively strong and is not about to do a deal on terms other than ones that would guarantee its survival. And Netanyahu seems to have run out of patience if the reports turn out to be true.
There are so many voices that we're hearing right now. And even on Sunday, before the reports that Netanyahu is looking to fully, entirely reoccupy the Gaza Strip, more than a dozen former senior Israeli security officials issued a joint video message with a call to end the war in Gaza. Add to that, of course, prominent activists such as Iris Chaim, the mother of Yotam, who was killed in an accident in the Gaza Strip. He was a hostage taken on October 7th, and he was slain along with two others in an accidental shooting by IDF soldiers in the Gaza Strip. And she said, of course, on stage that the prime minister essentially has laid out that ending the war would be surrendering to Hamas. And her view is, yes, it is time to surrender to Hamas. So what you just said as well, in that Hamas is feeling emboldened, do you feel that the entirety of Israel could support this idea of laying down weapons and surrendering to Hamas in order to get these 20 hopefully living hostages back?
I'm not sure that how much of the Israeli public would use that kind of terminology, but we've seen poll after poll that shows a majority of Israelis who would, even at the price of ending the war, do a deal to try and get back the rest of the hostages. So public opinion is not in favor of the option that Netanyahu is reportedly intending to advance, including because more soldiers face the risk of dying. The hostages would be in greater danger. It's a year almost since 6 Israeli hostages were killed by their captors who had been given orders to kill them, which I assume needs to be considered as very likely to be the case right now, if they believed the army was coming close, and the army was not aware that those 6 hostages were in that immediate area and 6 hostages' lives were lost. So I think that's a big factor also in public opinion. I would add, apart from the former security chiefs and other high-ranking people, intelligence chiefs and so on, who signed who appeared in this video and wrote a letter to President Trump, the chief of staff himself is reported to be very wary about what Netanyahu may be about to tell him to do. The army is the operational arm of the political echelon. It does what it is told. If he doesn't want to do it, for example, we've had unnamed sources saying, well, he can resign. Remember, this is not the chief of staff of October the 7th, Herzi Halevi. This is his successor after Halevi stepped down, and this is somebody who Netanyahu said he was very pleased to have in the position, but there appears to be friction between the coalition, or at least the inner cabinet especially, and the new chief of staff. And the message is being sent, I would say, that the chief of staff is wary of this. We should stress we don't really know what occupation means. What does it mean? That after that Israel will never pull back from Gaza? This is the day after scenario, or this is taking control of all of Gaza in order to try to further degrade Hamas, which is certainly not a military army of 24 battalions and is now a guerrilla force, but seems to be able to recruit and still to rule by fear in especially in those parts of Gaza, of course, where the army is not in control, and is able to kill Israeli soldiers as well, and still holds all those hostages. It's also not clear in terms of people power. I mean, there are some surreal processes playing out here, some of which we'll also discuss later. But on the very day that it was being leaked by people very close to the prime minister that this is the plan to conquer all of Gaza, maybe that's the better terminology, but I don't know, because occupation is certainly a word that has been put around. There has been talk of annexation, which would be permanent in parts of Gaza, close to the perimeter, maybe in northern Gaza. It's not at all clear whether this is the idea as well, but we don't hear, and Israel is gearing up to enable some kind of international mechanism, US supervised participation of the UAE and the Saudis and the Egyptians, which of course would depend on there being at least some role for the Palestinian Authority in order to give those outside controllers some kind of legitimacy in having a role in Gaza. In other words, you do need a legitimate, quote-unquote, Palestinian entity there, and Netanyahu has not been ready to embrace that. So it's not clear how this will play out. And as I was saying, on the very day that this was being leaked as the plan, the Knesset's 2 relevant committees ousted the head of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, the most important Knesset panel, Yuli Edelstein, from Netanyahu's own party, who lost his job as committee chair because he was not prepared to advance legislation that would maintain and enshrine in law the fact that almost all young ultra-Orthodox men don't serve in the army. So you've got this situation where the army is crying out for manpower, says it's people power, we should say, says it's about 12,000 soldiers short at the moment. There are something like 80,000 ultra-Orthodox young men of army age and eligibility who are not serving. So even as the army is saying, we need more recruits, you have the prime minister essentially saying, we're not giving you recruits from the largest part of the fastest growing part of the Israeli demographic. We're keeping them out of the army, but off the record or leaked from my circle, we will be expanding the Gaza operation, and you're going to have to make that work somehow with a 100% occupation of Gaza. Again, the fact is that Edelstein was ousted because he wouldn't advance that legislation. The reports are that the prime minister is inclined to expand the military operation in Gaza.
Right. It is very confusing, and it's quite possible that all of this is spin. Our prime minister is the master of playing the spin game. But I just want to add one more layer to this. And yesterday, the IDF announced it was canceling the practice of adding 4 extra months of service for conscripted troops. These are fighting troops, but that it would actually extend deployment time for special forces units in the future. So this is also in the mix here. And this, of course, concerns a swath of the fighting troops. And so you just have to wonder if indeed we are about to enter Gaza, and one would think you would need tens of thousands of troops to fully occupy it. Would the IDF on the same day be saying that they are going to cancel the reserve duty for thousands, at least, troops? It is all very confusing.
Well, I'd add a caveat to that. I think that's one way of looking at it. Hey, obviously this can't be true because the army wouldn't be announcing this slight easing of the terms. Or you might understand that this was the chief of staff signaling, I don't want a deepened military presence in Gaza. I don't want our troops to be continuing or taking on more strain. So I think you could interpret that either way.
Let's turn to a report that was released yesterday by the Hostages and Missing Families Forum, which states that the hostages held by Hamas in Gaza are, quote, at an immediate risk of death due to starvation. I'll quote a paragraph from the report. The hostages still held alive in Gaza are suffering from deliberate, prolonged, and systematic starvation, an advanced medical state of severe hunger, causing multi-system damage and posing an immediate risk of death. Obviously, the question of whether it was possible to defeat Hamas and get the hostages out is increasingly relevant every single day. And you have to wonder, with this at least reported leaked idea that Netanyahu wants to reconquer the entire Gaza Strip, has he just given up on the hostages entirely?
So 2 things we should stress. I think it was interesting to hear relatives of the hostages saying, obviously these are very painful reports and figures and medical assessments, but you can see it. We had these 2 videos that Hamas put out over the weekend, and you can see how unwell, the terrible condition of Ron Braslovsky and Eviatar David, who were the 2 hostages filmed. And I think you've had families of other hostages certain that their loved ones are in similar dire death's door, basically, is what the families are saying. Netanyahu would argue to the contrary, Amanda. I mean, if he was speaking, he would say, and I'm sure he will speak sooner or later again and explain if there is a changed strategy or tactic here. He would say, I'm trying to get the hostages out. I can't do a deal with these people. They're not willing. We were trying to do a deal whereby they would release 10 more living hostages. That would have left only, quote unquote, 10 more living hostages. We were doing everything to get that deal. Hamas is not prepared to do that deal. That's what Netanyahu would say. And therefore, the only way that we can get the hostages out is to further weaken Hamas. Either they will then ease their terms or we will get to the hostages ourselves. He's not said those specifics yet. But I assume that would be his thinking. That would be the thinking of those who, if they are acting with good intentions and honest intentions, they would believe that to be the case. The whole question of whether intensified military pressure and getting the hostages out are complementary or mutually exclusive processes has dogged Israel's approach from the very beginning of the war. And it has not been satisfactorily resolved, shall we say. But the fact is there have been very few hostages who have been extricated by the army. The overwhelming majority hugely have come home under the terms of deals under which the fighting was suspended. Netanyahu would argue, yes, and we were only able to get to those deals because of the military pressure that led to them. And as I say, most Israelis have long been. I'm not sure they were there from the beginning, but have long been of a mindset that says, if necessary, end the war, do everything to get home as many hostages as we can.
Let's go to a short break. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our editor, David Horovitz. Yesterday, the government voted unanimously to dismiss Attorney General Gali Baharav Miara from office following months, if not years, of confrontations between the two sides, in a decision that will have deep legal and political reverberations. The move was then immediately frozen by the High Court until the justices can rule on its legality. This was highly expected, David, that the court would immediately freeze this decision. So you have to just wonder why and why now?
Why the government chose to complete its process of firing the Attorney General? Why now? Because they've wanted to be rid of her. And I mean, she's very annoying. She tells them things like, you have to draft the ultra-Orthodox, you're breaking the law. She's, of course, the head of the state prosecution, so she's overseeing the criminal trial of the prime minister. He does not want to be on trial. If he can insert a more convenient attorney general, who knows? Maybe a plea bargain would be possible, which would not require him to vacate public office. So there's lots of reasons why. And of course, there's, the wider effort of the government to weaken, and I say this, other people may disagree, to weaken law enforcement. You have a multiple offender who is in charge of the police. I'm thinking of Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. You have the ousting of the Attorney General, and you have legislation which the government has relentlessly championed and is always seeking to advance, that would limit the independence and the capacity of the top court, of the Supreme Court, to intervene in government decisions. And remember, we have no separate legislature or with powers of its own. You essentially, in Israel, in terms of branches of government, you have the executive, the coalition and its leadership, and you have the judiciary. And the political push by the coalition is to marginalize the judiciary, and that's using polite language. So that's behind the timing. And now then there's the theory. There's a theory that says the government knows that the court is going to strike this down. I don't know. I'm not a legal expert. The argument of the government is that we have the right to fire the Attorney General. That's what the law states. We have certainly, I don't think they'd say this, but the fact is we have played fast and loose with the procedures. There was a committee that's supposed to weigh in. We couldn't get that committee staffed. So we set up our own ministerial committee whose only job was to fire the Attorney General, not to consider whether to fire her, in truth. I think with their hands on their hearts, they'd admit that, but they would say, but the government has the right to fire the Attorney General, and therefore the court has no right to strike this down. So either they think they will get this dismissal through the court, which I think is unlikely, or they will use the court's blocking of this dismissal as a really important piece of their argument against an ostensibly overly powerful court defying the will of the public as expressed by the actions of the government that was elected. Or there's a third theory which says that this is a smokescreen. And really, these things happened within minutes. Edelstein was ousted as head of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, and the Attorney General was fired, 1-2 in that order. And there are people who think, the real essential major issue here is the continued exclusion from the army of the ultra-Orthodox. And the fact that the Attorney General was fired and that this is going to be a big legal battle now will deflect attention from that, more widely resonant or impactful process as regards the Haredim. I'm not at all convinced by that argument. I think the government wants to fire the Attorney General. I think they hope that they will get her fired. And if the court does not allow the government to fire her, they will renew with ever more vigor their efforts to make sure that the court is increasingly unable to frustrate any of the moves that they may try to make in the future.
I'm of the opinion that the chessboard was set and the results were known ahead of time. But at the same time, you just have to wonder what is the end result that is being expected here? Meaning, we keep throwing around the term constitutional crisis and things of that nature. But at the same time, I'm not seeing the people of Israel taking to the streets in the same way that they once would have when these terms are being thrown around. What are you seeing, David?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the notion of constitutional crisis and the demise of Israeli democracy is becoming normalized. There were moments, I mean, Netanyahu paused when he had fired his defense minister, for example. There were moments, I'm talking about Yoav Gallant, in ancient history, and hundreds of thousands of people came out to demonstrate. It's striking, I think, that there have been sometimes, even recently, relatively large demonstrations against the government, larger or, yeah, I think it's fair to say larger than some of the demonstrations on behalf of the hostages and a deal. So there is still a great deal of public anger, but it is certainly not of the public vast level that it had been in the past. And that's, I think, part of the strategy here, to normalize the fact that the democracy is in crisis. Okay, the Shin Bet chief was forced out in a process that, became relevant for the court battle, but ultimately he spared Israel a deeper constitutional crisis by agreeing to resign. The Attorney General will not go quietly, I don't think. She is not, I mean, Netanyahu would like to implicate her in October the 7th, but I don't think she is widely or credibly implicated in October the 7th. She does not feel that she is obligated to resign her position in the way that security chiefs and military chiefs and many Israelis would say political chiefs should. So I don't think she's going to step down. I think we will have a tussle. It's, if you want to get into the minutiae, which I suppose we should, the justice who's been handling the petitions over the Attorney General is the deputy president of the court and the most senior conservative member of the court. In other words, he's one of the justices who might have been thought to be most inclined to be somewhat empathetic or more empathetic to the government stance than some of his colleagues on the bench. So he chose not to prevent the whole process by which the Attorney General was fired. In other words, he said, I can't be issuing injunctions against something that hasn't happened. I'm not going to do that. But he had already, as you said before, said ahead of time that if she was fired, that process would be immediately frozen until the court hears petitions and rules. And having said that some weeks ago, he yesterday, immediately after the vote was taken, unanimous vote among ministers to fire Gali Baharav Miara, Judge Solberg reissued this decision. That vote is frozen. It is her dismissal is suspended. And by the way, you have to keep inviting her to meetings, and her rulings retain the force of law, as they do. So the government had talked about not inviting her to meetings, boycotting her, somehow bypassing her decisions. If the Attorney General says A, B, and C tomorrow, and the government chooses not to follow her ruling, according to this statement from the Deputy Chief of the Supreme Court yesterday, the government would be breaching the law. That would be illegal. They are not allowed to reject her rulings, even though they would like to think that they have fired her.
Okay, let's turn to something that we've been alluding to the entire episode, and that's lawmakers on the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee voted 9-7 to appoint Likud MK Boaz Bismuth as their chairman yesterday afternoon and officially pushed out former chairman Yuli Edelstein in a move designed to end an impasse over legislation on military draft exemptions for the ultra-Orthodox community. But my question is, David, what makes Bismuth the best candidate to now push legislation forward?
Well, that's a very good question, Amanda. Both of them are members of Likud. Edelstein was the speaker. He has leadership ambitions. He has crossed swords with Netanyahu in the past, but he refused to advance the kind of legislation that Netanyahu needed to keep the ultra-Orthodox parties loyal in his coalition. One has left and the other has resigned its ministry. So I'm talking about United Torah Judaism and Shas. I'm not sure that Netanyahu really wanted Bismuth. There was another Likud MK who's being investigated for alleged rape, and Netanyahu was forced to reconsider or chose to decide that maybe entrusting the most important committee in the Knesset, which has oversight over, for example, parts of the security establishment where other Knesset members are not even privy to the information, never mind the public. It's a very powerful committee, the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. So he went with Bismuth instead. Now, Boaz Bismuth is a Netanyahu loyalist, also, of course, a member of the Likud party. The answer to your question will become apparent, I would think, fairly soon. In other words, is Bismuth just going to advance some legislation that essentially, however it's dressed up, will not significantly raise the number of ultra-Orthodox young men who serve in the army? Or is he going to try and actually genuinely significantly raise the number of ultra-Orthodox recruits with sanctions on their study institutions or sanctions on them personally and all kinds of other economic and other pressures? So we'll know fairly soon. Edelstein, shortly before he was booted yesterday, released the text of the legislation he was attempting to champion. We've reported on it. You can read the elements of that legislation. I heard Likud people on the radio this morning talking about their criticism of Edelstein was it took him so long and they didn't really even know what was in his law. I mean, some of these arguments, they're fairly not credible, shall we say. I mean, I heard a Likud minister, Gila Gamliel, saying, we didn't know what he was planning. But of course they knew what he was planning. Netanyahu had seen the text. They'd met with Netanyahu went one evening a few weeks ago to try and get more favorable legislation for the Haredim moving. They looked at what Edelstein had drafted. The Haredim had seen it. So the arguments are pretty weak, I would say. We'll see what Mr. Bismuth intends to do.
And just to remind our listeners, of course, that the Knesset is officially on recess. So all of this took place in emergency sessions.
Yeah, but you know what, Amanda? At least the committees are working. I mean, I'm not sure we can fairly say that all the things they are doing are in the wider public good, but I don't think we should complain that the Knesset members are actually, doing some work as opposed to, going on holiday or spending time abroad, as many of them are doing.
Amen, David. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.